Welcome everyone to the Ramalinga Swamy Center's colloquium series on equity and social determinants of health. We are extremely honored today to host Dr. Shireen Jejeebhoy, who is a prominent demographer and social scientist, as our speaker for our colloquium series today. Shireen is currently the visiting distinguished faculty at the International Institute for Population Sciences in Mumbai. She's the founder and director of the Aksha Center for Equity and Wellbeing, and also in Mumbai, and is the president of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population in Paris. Previously, she has served as a senior associate at the Population Council in India and as a scientist with the Reproductive Health and Research Department with the World Health Organization in Geneva. Her research is focused on adolescent and youth health and development, and she in fact led India's first subnational survey of youth and the empowerment of women and girls, gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health and rights, including abortion and child marriage. I think a lot of us who worked in public health over the years have come across your work in some capacity or the other, and we are extremely honored to be having you here today. I'm going to just let you know, participants, please put your questions in the Q&A box as and when they occur to you during the talk or immediately after. They will be picked up for a moderated discussion afterwards. And please know that the talk will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And Dr. Shireen, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for a brilliant introduction, which is far too flattering. Let me start by thanking Aditi, Abha, and the Ramalinga Swamy Center for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that I feel so deeply about and have worked on for many years. I'm going to, oh dear. Can we start sharing my slides? Yeah. Okay. I apologize if I have to turn off my video. My network tends to be a little bit unstable, but I'll carry on as much as I can. So what I'm going to do here is give a brief overview of the situation of adolescents and young people or youth, that is those aged 10 to 24 in India, and then really focus on one domain of SRHR, which is child marriage. As you know, one of the SDGs, Target 5.3, calls for the elimination of harmful practices, including child, early, and forced marriage, to be achieved by 2030. Next. I don't need to say this in this group, but many will ask, why is it important now that we pay attention to the young? You know, this is a population that's neither children nor adult, yet we either treat them like children, for example, in health, in decision-making and choices, we treat them like children. When it comes to maternal health and labor force participation, we treat them like adults. But they are a unique population, and we need to pay attention to that. So the important thing, it is their right that we focus on them. And the concept of a triple dividend, by focusing on the young, we're focusing on their lives and their rights in their adolescence and youth. We're focusing on their life when they become adult. For example, smoking behavior today will determine their lives in the future. And then for the next generation of youth that they produce. Yes, it's a very large population, and neither our national goals nor SDGs can be achieved without investing in the young. So there are many reasons for investing in the young, and there are many reasons why we cannot fail our youth. Yeah, next. Let me just run through. I'm not going to talk about them here, but I will be speaking about them. 6 key markers that define what it means to be on track towards achieving a successful transition towards adulthood. As I said before, I'll be focusing on delaying marriage, which is one of them. So we're looking at what are the minimum requirements in order that we can say that an adolescent is making a successful transition to adulthood. So to do this, what I've done is piece together a story from the available data that I have from national surveys, subnational surveys, smaller surveys, qualitative studies, to show what is the situation and how are young people doing today. Yeah, so let's start with education. Next slide. On education, we're looking at not only how much education, here we are, but also the quality of education. And I'll come to that later. Today, a marker of a successful transition to adulthood is a minimum of a secondary school education. And this slide shows that we're getting there. We haven't reached there. Secondary school increase has been for both boys and girls, especially for girls over the last 10, 15 years. Gender gaps, as you see, are narrowing. So now there's only a 5 percentage point difference between girls and boys. Today, I attended the ASR Center's new report release, and they say that the gender difference is now, for those aged 14 to 18, is under 1%, which is even better news. But clearly, there's a long way to go. Many are left behind and haven't reached this marker, and that is something of concern. If you look at the left side, you'll see that even completion of primary school education is not yet universal, despite the fact that these youth are 20 to 24. So that is of concern. But coming to the next point, which is learning outcomes. Next slide, yeah. Learning outcomes. This is very worrying, and today's ASA report really didn't give me much more optimism than what I've shown here. You see on the left that learning outcomes are stagnating. Reading at a class 2 level text, among those in class 8, which is the darker bar, you see it's only 44 and 45%. So it hasn't really changed over time. If you look at the right side, which is the Dasra survey that was conducted in Jharkhand in 2018, you see more or less the same kinds of issues as far as reading is concerned. But what's really of concern is that while reading is reaching 73, 70%, maths, the third set of bars, solving a small division problem, a 3-digit division problem, is really a very, very poor among this age group of 15 to 21. Knowing India's capital, you would think everyone would know, that is also very diminished. But what is really worrying is that and this is a community-wide study, that the gender differences are huge. So you look at the difference. So the first lighter blue one is boys, And as you would expect, boys are doing better than girls. The second one, the dark blue one, is married girls. Unmarried girls. So unmarried girls and boys are relatively similar in reading, but the gap starts appearing in these other issues. But married girls are definitely very, very disadvantaged. So something to think about as we go forward. Understanding weight, something that all young people should know, is also very, very low among girls, 42 and 29%, for example. Then coming to labor force participation, or at least access to skilling, access to employment, making young people employable. What we know from the data that exist is that this is also a significant concern, particularly for girls. So labor force participation among youth, which is how the periodic labor force survey defines youth, 15 to 29, you see that just 25% of girls aged 15 to 29 are in the labor force, compared to 64% of boys, of young men. Access to skilling, we talk so much about Skill India and Skill Mission, but only 4 and 5% of our youth are taking advantage of these formal skilling opportunities. And then there is a term which is also now a SDG indicator. Am I echoing?
No, Shireen, we can hear you properly.
I'm echoing to myself.
Oh.
Anyway, so there's a term called NEET, which is the share of young youth, that's 18 to 24, who are not in school, not in education, not working, and not in training. And here again, you see that India is among the highest. Other South Asian countries are also high, but in India, 42% of young females compared to just 11% of young men are NEET. Again, something that shows that the gender disparities remain very wide. Next. And then the third and fourth pillars are talking about health, which are not looking at general health in the interest of time, but looking at sexual and reproductive health and some indicators that are of particular concern to the young. So one of those is entry into sexual life. And of course, in India, the majority of entry into sexual life takes place in marriage. And the latest figures are showing that 23% of 20 to 24-year-olds marry in childhood. But there's also a growing percentage of young people who experience sex before marriage. And those from the surveys that we have in Bihar, Jharkhand, UP at state level, and from the Youth in India survey that was conducted in 2006-07, you see that today, or the most recent figures suggest around 6% of girls and about 14% of boys. It varies a little from state to state. It increased a little over time. But generally, this is the picture we're seeing, or at least the reported picture we're seeing across the state. Where premarital sex happens, it's often unsafe. As you see here, a large number of boys, very few girls, had experienced multiple partner relations. Very few of those who are sexually active premaritally had reported consistent condom use. And a significant number, 7% is a relatively large number, of girls are reported to have had an unwanted, or report themselves to have had an unwanted premarital pregnancy. So these are all concerns suggesting that premarital sex, A, may be increasing, and B, where it takes place, tends to be unsafe. It can also be non-consensual. We see in our surveys that forced premarital sexual intercourse by pressure or force or physical force is reported by about 5% of girls and reported to have been perpetrated by about 5%. I mean, boys themselves are reporting that they perpetrated forced sex on girls. And that's about 5% too. Of course, that might be a little bit underreported, but those are the figures we have. And all that, I think, to a large extent, can be attributed to the fact that entry into sexual life is poorly informed. For example, when you ask about knowledge, just over a quarter of boys and girls, and slightly, well, half of married girls, know that a woman can become pregnant at first sex. This is a basic sex ed point that all young people need to know. And of course, in India, very few are receiving sexuality education. And by these numbers that I'm reporting from Jharkhand, 7% of boys, 26% of unmarried girls, and 14% of married girls. I'm not talking about only sex education in school, but sex education at community level as well. So you see that sexuality education is so poorly disseminated in our country that forced sex, unsafe sex are not surprising to us, and clearly of much concern, because premarital sex is certainly going to be increasing over the next rounds. So what we're finding is that just like the total fertility rate, as you know, total fertility rate in India has now reached replacement. And similarly, for the young, total age-specific fertility, that's the fertility of the age group 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 and beyond, has fallen drastically from 90 to 43 in the most recent survey, from 209 to 154 among those 20 to 24. Institutional delivery among the young is fairly consistent with what it is for women in general. That's 89%. It's identical to what is the situation for women in general. Contraception, although I'll be talking about contraception later also, but I just wanted to say that for the young, what is really important is contraception before the first pregnancy. We know that marriage takes place early, and we know that marriage often takes place without consent. But contraception before the first pregnancy tends to be rare. In a study we did of girls married for less than 5 years, the demand for contraception to postpone the first pregnancy was high. It was like 50% wanted to have control or wanted to control when they or delay their first pregnancy. But only 10% of that 50% had actually practiced contraception. And this says something about the system. Why doesn't the system reach them? Largely because our our providers have the same general norm that exists in the society more generally, that young girls should display their ability to have children in order to secure themselves in their marital homes. And then marital violence tends to be considerable. The NFHS reports that 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds had experienced sexual violence, and 22 to 25% of older girls had experienced any spousal violence. So it's quite a large proportion who are experiencing sexual or physical violence. Yeah, next. Can you move?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh
This-
no.
Sorry for this.
Radhika, if you want, I can share. I don't have that issue.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead this
Okay,
time.
so
and
the
then-
next point is looking at girls' agency. I'm sure this is clearly a marker of a successful transition to adulthood. Do girls have the agency to make decisions, to move around, to have mobility, to own and operate, own and control the economic resources? So what we find, and here I'm showing data from 2 state-level surveys. The green is boys, the reddish is unmarried girls, and the dark blue is married girls, showing the differences between these 3 groups in terms of decision-making. And here you can see that although the 2 states look a little different, it's boys who have the decision-making power much more than girls, and even more than married girls, who also have a little decision-making power in their homes. When it comes to mobility, almost all boys in both states have freedom of movement, whereas unmarried girls have much less, and married girls have the least freedom of movement. And then you're seeing, by and large, the same picture re-emerge when we're looking at control, ownership and control over money and resources. So agency is still compromised among girls and young women, and we can show that through quantitative data. So I'm given a sort of broad brush of the key markers of a successful transition to adulthood. Now I'd like to turn to one particular, next slide please, one particular domain of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is the marriage situation. There's been a lot of attention to the huge vulnerability of child marriage, both globally. As I said, SDG 5.3 talks about eliminating child early and forced marriage, which, by the way, by which they mean marriage without the girl's own participation. And in India ourselves, we have a number of laws that are looking at child marriage and child marriage in a more general way. And we're talking, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk more on that, in terms of even raising the minimum legal age at marriage for girls higher, which is something that many of us have doubts about. But let me not digress. Let's go to the next slide. If that, we got it. So this slide is showing the child marriage situation in India over time. from the early 90s to the current situation. As you see, we're definitely on a downward trend, which is very heartening. Particularly between 2005-06 and now, we're seeing major declines in child marriage. But even now, I don't think it's something for us to be very happy about, to think that almost 1 in 4 girls is marrying before she's 18. And in some states, the rates are even higher. For example, in Tripura, Assam, Bihar, Telangana, and West Bengal. So child marriage is declining, but there are huge gaps, not only geographical gaps, but as you see, rural-urban gaps and other gaps that I'll be sharing a little later. Next slide. And not only the age at marriage, but as we know, forced marriage or marriage with and without consent continues to be very traditional. So if you see here, compared to the last slide where everything is declining, here everything remains very flat. So if you look at the third line, which is parent arranged, that is, parents are arranging without any say of the girl. That has gone down. Sorry, I can't see the last number. It's blocked by... Anyway, it's fallen a great deal to 32%, if I'm not wrong. The dark red line is talking about semi-arranged. That's arranged by parents, but in which the girl has also had a say. And that has hearteningly increased to 58, 59%. And self-arranged marriages, that is what we call love marriages, have increased very little. From the last is from the cohort born in the 80s to 4% among them to 8% among the youngest cohort. So you can see this situation is hardly changing. And meeting for the first time on the wedding day has changed very slowly. So we went from 69% among the oldest cohort to, what is it now? It's now 62% in this the youngest. So it hasn't changed. Young people are still meeting their husbands or wives for the first time at the wedding, on the wedding day, which tells you a lot about their ability then to exercise agency in their married lives and to have more egalitarian spousal relations in post-marriage. So this is another concern. Again, it's part of the SDG target, but I don't think anyone is paying attention to it. The next slide. So here I pulled together some excerpts from different in-depth interviews that were undertaken in different studies among girls and their parents and their mothers. I'm not going to read them. I think you can, let me give you a minute to read them. But I think the main point of all these perceptions is that girls acquiesce. And girls acquiesce because by acquiescing, they are more likely to have support from their natal homes should things go wrong. Of course, they're acquiescing because everyone acquiesces. But I think this is a key concern at the back of their minds. I need some backup in case the marriage is bad. Okay, next slide. So coming now to the drivers, why the persistence of child and non-consensual marriage in India? The overarching drivers at macro level are, as we all know, the extent of poverty, the entrenched patriarchal norms that persist, and the gender inequality that persists. And also we're seeing the humanitarian crisis situations, conflict, natural disasters, even COVID, have really precipitated a spike in child marriage. Next slide, please. So here I'm just showing the extent to which the inequalities are perpetuating themselves. So if you look at the wealth quintile, the richest quintile is just 8% have a girl who's been married at before age 18, compared to 40% among the poorest. The same general picture emerges when we're looking at education, and the same general picture seems to be emerging, or to a lesser extent now, when we're looking at child marriage. So you're seeing an almost 30 percentage point disparity between those in the first and fifth quintiles and wealth quintiles, and between those with no education and those with secondary or more education, and about 12 points between the rural and urban. So in a way, you can see that poverty and disadvantage is perpetuating itself. The poor marrying earlier, perpetuating poverty. Next slide. So what are these drivers, and how does poverty play out at the household level? Whatever surveys exist that try to explore factors underlying child marriage will talk about the economic burden of daughters to the husband's family. And hence girls are saying any further delay can force them into even more debt. They want to reduce some of the burden. So poverty is playing a key role in perpetuating child marriage. It's a strategy for alleviating poverty in humanitarian crisis situations, to cushion the shock of unemployment, loss of income, and fears of girls' safety. For example, during the Kosi floods in Bihar some years ago, during the COVID lockdown, we're seeing whatever small data we have suggests that child marriage spiked when families lost their sources of income, when insecurity became more pronounced. Distress calls to child helplines showed an escalation in child marriage in the early days of the lockdown. So humanitarian crisis situations are also perpetuating child marriage. Traditionally, even in poor households, it's not appropriate, not considered appropriate for girls to contribute to the household economy. There's this sense that whatever they earn as an unmarried girl is really to secure their lives when they enter their husband's home. She should use the money there. We can't take earnings from a girl. Girl belongs to someone else's family, so she should use it there. Then there are the prohibitive costs of dowry and huge wedding expenses. So marrying the girl young requires smaller dowries. Marrying all your daughters together, as this mother is saying, I married them all together. There's no money at home. It cost less because all three were married at one time, although feeding people was very expensive. And finally, the system is failing. Knowledge of the laws, we have the law, but families are not aware of this law. And if they are aware of the law, they know there's no attempt to impose the law. I think, again, because those who impose the law hold the same norms and values as the community more generally. And there needs to be far more education or that allows those implementing the law to do it in a more humane way than, for example, what happened in Assam. And for those who are affected by the law to better understand what it means to marry their children young. Next. Then I think patriarchy and unbalanced gender norms play a large role in perpetuating child marriage. Child marriage is seen as a social norm. Everyone knows that getting married early is bad, but everyone does it. And you don't want to be different. So everyone will continue the practice, despite the fact that early marriage is recognized as a social evil. Then the perceived lower value of girls, the investment in girls yielding no returns is yet another norm, or wouldn't say a norm, but a belief that is very widespread among particularly rural households. So raising a daughter is like watering someone else's garden. So why invest in them? They provide no returns. So it's better to marry them off early than to invest in their education. Even some households will say in feeding them. I think more than anything is the concerns about girl sexuality. Virginity is so closely linked to family honor, and the fear of even talking to a boy can be seen as a blot on family honor. And so it's much more important for girls to be married early. If a girl goes off with someone and gets married, we'll have to hold our heads in shame. I would be afraid. She wouldn't be allowed back home. Of course, boys can go wherever they want. And then there is a real, as well as a perceived fear of girls' safety in public places. There are stories of harassment on public transport, unwanted touch outside the home. And so that is also a major way by which patriarchy and unbalanced gender norms, and in this case, even the reality, is such a concern for families that marriage is seen as the only safe way out. So those are some of the drivers, next slide, of child marriage. Coming now to some of the outcomes that we know or that we are beginning to know about child marriage. What are the outcomes for girls' lives, for marriage, for married life? Some things are very clear. Next slide. Yeah. Giving birth in early or mid adolescence is associated with huge health risks. And now giving birth before age 15 has almost disappeared, as you see. It's less than 1%. But still, almost 1 in 10 girls gives birth in later adolescence, 8%, as you see, and more than 1 in 5 before age 20, 42%. 23% are giving birth today below the age of 20. So when we talk of eliminating early marriage, we mean by age 20, by age 21. And it's clear that even that is very difficult for us to achieve. Neonatal mortality, we can't get good age-specific data for maternal mortality, but from the general global literature, it appears that maternal mortality below age 15 is particularly dangerous, and that after 15, maybe 17, 18, tends to be among the safest ages. So safety is not the key issue here. However, mortality of the next generation, the neonates that young mothers give birth to, is hugely affected by age of the mother, the time of birth. So neonatal mortality is like 34 among those age 15 to 19, and it falls to 23, 26 in the next two age groups. And overall, it's 25%. So girls giving birth in adolescence are hugely disadvantaged in terms of neonatal mortality. Yeah, next. Contraception and unmet need. We talked a little bit earlier about contraception before the first pregnancy, but here we're talking about contraception more generally at the time of the survey. And we see the gray bars are those 15 to 19, the light blue are those 20 to 24, and the dark blue are those 15 to 49. So clearly those, and MCPR is contraceptive prevalence rate using modern methods, not traditional. It's very low for those age 15 to 19, increases among those age 20 to 24, but still nothing even close to what overall the overall situation is. To me, that's not particularly worrying, because it's much more important to know whether they're contracepting despite, whether they're not contracepting despite having a demand for it, wanting no more children, wanting to space their child. And if you look at the last bars, those are talking about the unmet need for contraception. And again, you see that those in the youngest age groups, 20 to 24 and 15 to 19, are most likely to have, at least are more likely to report an unmet need for contraception than the population more generally. So the population in general, that's 15 to 49, only 9% report an unmet need, whereas for those age 15 to 24, we're looking at 17 to 18%. And I think this again is reflecting the fact that our providers are simply not reaching these young couples until they've had their first pregnancy. So in that sense, young married girls are disadvantaged once more. Yeah, next slide. I'm showing this, that is mental health, which is becoming a much more important issue recently among the young. We have a lot of data emerging that suggests that mental health is one of the leading causes of ill health among the young globally, as well as in India. Here are some survey findings from Bihar, Jharkhand, and UP of those aged up to 21. Again, showing the situation for unmarried boys, unmarried girls, and married girls. These are self-reported symptoms. And again, you see that boys are least likely to report severe depression or related symptoms. They're least likely to report suicidal thoughts. Unmarried girls, more likely to report severe depression or suicidal thoughts. 3 to 5% is quite a large number. And then of most concern is that married girls are showing even higher levels of moderate to severe depression-related symptoms, 5 to 7%, and suicidal thoughts, 6 to 9%. So we're showing really that this population, particularly of girls, unmarried as well as married, are very disadvantaged in terms of mental health outcomes. And the married girls are particularly disadvantaged. Again, something that's revealing the heightened vulnerability of married girls. Here are 2 slides which are showing how child marriage compromises married life. And if you look at these, you'll see that in terms of girls' agency and attitudes, you see that those marrying early are much more likely to have limited agency and suggest attitudes that are much more traditional. They are also more likely to experience controlling behavior by their husband and much more likely to experience physical or sexual violence and the perpetration of violence during pregnancy. So early marriage and particularly child marriage are extremely of concern in terms of girls' post-marriage practices or experiences. Yeah, next slide. And by the way, these are all controlling for their socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. The next slide, could you go back one, please? Yeah. The next slide is showing how marriage without meaningful consent, that is, compared to those who selected their own spouses, how are those who are in semi-arranged marriages or in fully arranged marriages doing in terms of some of the same indicators as you saw in the previous slides. And again, as you would expect, those in fully arranged marriages are significantly less likely to exercise agency, to report egalitarian gender role attitudes, to report a more equal marital life in terms of spousal communication and contraception. But they are no less or more likely to experience, or no less likely to experience physical or sexual violence. And I think the reason why girls who marry of their own choice lose that family support, and as a result, they are no better off in terms of physical or sexual violence, because they have no option but to remain in the marriage. Yeah, next. So just some thoughts. Next slide. Yeah, well, achieving the SDG target is going to be difficult. So that's the bad news. The UNICEF projection suggests that even with the current pace of change, by 2030, 15 to 17% will marry in adolescence before they're 18. And even if we double the pace of progress, it'll remain at something like 20%. So what we need, and here's the good news, are multi-pronged and evidence-based strategies. These strategies are available. We know what many of the best practices are, but what it needs is our commitment and our investment. And that today needs to be also accelerated. Thank you. I'm sorry for going over.
Thank you, Shireen. That was a fascinating talk. I really, really enjoyed looking at all the evidence, but it was so sobering to know that, yes, things have changed, but no, so many things haven't. And that the drivers of child marriage are, still so well entrenched in our society that it will require, a whole gender revolution to dislodge the practice. A number of questions come to mind, and I'm happy to see some questions already in the Q&A. But I just wanted to start off by raising a couple of questions about so what do we do? Which is, really bringing into question the role of the state, but also, and, the state through its approach to legal, the legal approach, raising the age at marriage, but also in terms of adolescent sexual and reproductive health programs, and how they might how they might get reprogrammed, because we know that a lot of the patriarchy is so embedded even within programs. What's it going to take to actually institute the best practices, or mainstream what is well known about best practices? Any ideas on that, Shireen?
I mean, that's the crux of the stalling of the changes in child marriage. The role of the state has been very superficial and in a way blind. I think although we have instances where those implementing the law have actually, nobody wants their father or to go to jail. So, of course, the difference between what's reported and what's reported and what is a fact are going to diverge a lot. And if you look at the National Crimes Records Bureau reports, there are huge disparities. But your point in, sexuality education, reaching the community, informing the community in something less than a punitive way, which is what I started to say, which is what some experiments in, I think Jagori has done, some experiments in Bihar, where those implementing the law, once they find an impending marriage, have stalled that marriage in a much more humane way. And those are the ways that we need to implement the law. And that's so far, we haven't seen that happening. So I think even today, the last NCRB report says that only 1,000 cases were reported under the PCMA Act. So I think sexuality education, gender education, gender transformative education, we've neglected boys. We need to engage boys in this whole endeavor so that they themselves are demanding a more egalitarian spousal relationship. We need to reach parents, which hasn't yet taken place. So simply looking blindly at, here's the law, implement it, and expect it to be implemented, I think is very short-sighted. Sorry, I'm not answering your question. We have a lot of strategies that we know will work. We need to find alternatives for girls, for example, to child marriage. And to some extent, I think those kinds of things are those kinds of ideas are beginning to enter the mainstream. But in terms of the state, whether that has entered into that debate, I don't know.
I mean, that is really the challenge, I think, to dislodge some of the, patriarchal ideas
Yeah.
within state-run programs. And, it is also a bit unfair to expect NGOs to pick up and do,
Exactly.
what the state can more widely. But there are a couple of questions now, and I would urge the others. There was Archana who had her hand up. So if you can put your question in, that would be good. Piyush Kumar asked, do we have any evidence on the spatial distribution of child or early marriage? Perhaps there are district or block level drivers that could be addressed to get closer to SDG targets. I think that's something you also alluded to, didn't you, about the big geographical variations and the need for contextual approaches. So, yes.
Yes, Piyush, thanks. I mentioned the state level geographic variation, but as you say, we have data at district level from NFHS that can also shed light. I'm afraid I don't have that. I did some work on Orissa, which showed quite a lot of district level variation. And I bet all states will have district level variation. Block level drivers, if we're looking at block level data, they tend to be a little bit weaker. So let's look at least at district level. And I agree that contextual differences will emerge if we look at district level factors and, hone our programs to acknowledge those differences between districts. I mean, ultimately, there are a few strategies that work, but how we get there may vary from district to district, depending on the sociocultural situation, on the systemic factors existing in that district, and so on. The availability of jobs. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the humanitarian issue is, of course, the very big one about which people have no control. And Priyanka Mala asked, what questions shall we ask in humanitarian crisis? For example, recent earthquake to reduce child marriage and better SRH rights of adolescents. A big question.
Another big question. Well, I think once we're aware that this is one of the key risks of a crisis situation, we need to be prepared, and we already have reproductive health packages that are distributed, for example. That's easier to do than ensure that child marriage is reduced. But I think there are probably actions that one can take to protect girls, to offer subsidies, to offer families cash transfers during crisis situations so that the acute poverty-related factors and the acute safety concerns and other traditional concerns can be mitigated to some extent. I think cash transfers have had a lot of success in many situations, and perhaps that should be reconsidered. We have considered that in as a COVID response, but I don't know how effectively that was conducted.
There are other questions, and out of curiosity, Shireen, is there any data available on abortions among teenage girls? Especially now with medical, abortion becoming more popular. Are surveys collecting that information, or is it too sensitive?
Well, first of all, I think data are very poor on abortion and abortion in general, abortion among the young. But we are collecting them, and surveys that have been focused on the young have tended to ask about unwanted pregnancy. And then obviously the next question would be, what did you do about it? So we do have data. Sometimes the best data come from a more self-selected population, for example, college-going students who are less inhibited about giving accurate information. But nevertheless, there is a sense of, one thing we know for sure is that when the unmarried have an unwanted pregnancy, it's almost always resolved by abortion. We also know that among young women, it's not so unusual to terminate the first pregnancy because they want to get to know their husband, they're still in school, they're concerned about careers. And so that's also not so unusual. But in terms of whether we have data on a national level, I'm not so sure. So.
Right. I mean, in some ways, there are so many different populations in India, and they don't all resonate with each other in terms of their norms and practices. But with social media getting so widespread and pervasive, I mean, it can have both a positive but also a negative effect in terms of reinforcing adverse gender norms, but also perhaps giving access to information that adolescents don't have in any case. And there may well be a gender difference in terms of who has access to social media as well.
That is there, but the ASER report today again was very encouraging and showed that gap also is narrowing in terms of who owns, I think they said, who ownership of a smartphone, use of social media, and so on. But I think one thing I thought of is that now that medical abortion has become so widely used in India, and although the law doesn't allow it, widely accessed from medical shops without a prescription, I think this offers, and we know that it tends to be safe, even if it's improperly used. It's not going to kill the person. And so I think that offers the young, and in a way, the freedom to engage in relations and to exercise their choice in ways that were not available to them earlier. But again, we did some work about 10 years ago, maybe things have changed now, that suggests that unmarried girls compared to married girls were they were much less likely to recognize the pregnancy. So they were more likely to have an abortion later in the second trimester than were the married girls, who could recognize them faster, who had family support, and so were able to quickly terminate the unwanted pregnancy.
Oh, and it goes back to what you were saying about
Yeah.
very poor knowledge and
Sexuality education.
yes, exactly. Sophia Thomas asks, given that adolescents and young adults are active on social media and have access to smartphones, can this be a viable strategy to improve health outcomes? Are there best practices or programs that point in this direction in India or elsewhere?
I don't know about best practices, but yes, many youth are getting their information from social media, from the media, from the internet. It's not always accurate information, although increasingly it's become more and more accurate. So of course, it depends on which site young people are visiting. There are a number of really excellent websites that offer information, but we really don't have much data on what is available. Surely, access to social media will be the means of the future to get information on various aspects of pregnancy and sexual and reproductive health. But at the same time, I think individualized questions, counseling, the access to a mentor, access to someone with whom you can share your very unique problem. I have a boyfriend, I don't know, he's pressuring me to have sex, what do I do? Those kinds of websites do exist. I think there's something called Go Nisha Go, which is now available, which has many interesting, twists and turns in a girl's life that will allow, some knowledge to be conveyed in a more youth-friendly way.
Right. It's like those agony aunt columns in the
Yeah, but I suppose those are personalized too.
except the time lag used to be much longer, I thought. And now it can be more instant.
True.
On a slightly unrelated note, I mean, Roshni asks a question about sex selection techniques. And while education is a positive development indicator, how do we counter the results in terms of the more educated people also being much more inclined and aware of sex selection techniques? Do we still only pursue education as an indicator, or the quality of education for girls and boys to counter the menace of sex selection? Do we need a change in our strategy to counter sex selection in India? I know this is not completely linked to the topic, but if you would like to respond, otherwise,
I think this is really one of those issues that that it's very difficult to suggest what kind of programs will work. We know that it's happening. We've done work in Haryana which showed that, if you write in red ink, it's a boy. If you write in blue ink, it's a girl, or vice versa. Or, there are ways that they can still subvert the system and be able to convey the sex of the fetus. Yes, it's not only the educated, it's also the wealthiest, the best off among us know where to go, and which provider will do it. So while there is a law, and the law has been very proactive in holding those providers responsible, it's very difficult. I'm sure that there are a lot that sort of escape. So, of course, we have to emphasize the whole gender education but that's a much more generational advantage. But in this work we had done in Haryana, we found that in a district of Haryana in which the government officials held a night, what they call the night darbar, at village level. So that reflects a lot of commitment, where they would hold these night darbars. Those districts tended to reveal much less sex-selective abortion than did, or at least a much more equal sex ratio at birth than did others where such kind of interventions were not happening. But though even there it was minor. So where people want to, it's really very difficult. And I think there has not been that kind of commitment from our governments to really investigate providers. And it's not abortion providers. I think we have to be very clear that it's not abortion providers that should necessarily be those who, yes, they may also do the sonography and the prenatal sex detection, but it's those people who reveal the sex of the fetus who are really the ones who need to be, who are the ones in the chain who break the link. So I think that needs to be emphasized. It's not the abortion providers and it's not the abortion seekers in general, but it's those who are revealing the sex of that is, those who are conducting the diagnostics and who subvert the law by revealing the sex of the fetus, who are the ones who should be most addressed.
That's true, because otherwise there is the danger of safe abortion services getting
Absolutely.
constrained, and that isn't really.
Yeah.
That's right. I don't see any other questions. If there are any, please do put them in the chat. We do have a little time for questions. But I think, from whatever you have said, I mean, your entire presentation was so revealing because you had all the data and which spoke of such a dire need for, gender equality. I mean, yes, things have improved. Of course it has. And as I said, we have multiple populations coexisting. But the fact that we still have national averages that are so dire also speaks to the need for, a real good gender project that will really will invest in girls and empower them, Otherwise we'll only be putting band-aids over issues that keep cropping up every now and then.
I see one question. It says need clarification in the chat. It says need clarification. Is it right to call 15 to 19 children? They are no longer children. Instead, it may be more appropriate to call them adolescent or teenage. I'm following the WHO classification, which calls those 10 to 19 as adolescents, 15 to 24 as youth, and 10 to 24, the entire age group, as young people. But you're right, there's a lot of confusion because, for example, the CRC considers children as all those under 18. Child marriage is therefore considered as those who marry under 18. So there's a lot of confusion in terminology, and if you talk to those who are really professionals in this area, they will say that there's no such thing. You can't apply age boundaries, that you have to look at the development of the individual, which of course is very difficult to do. So, and on whether we should call them adolescent or teenage, well, the professional term tends to be adolescent, but of course, much is made of teenage pregnancy, teenage sex, whatever. So, choose your pick.
Leila Varki has a question. Gender norms take time to change. Could you comment on North-South differences?
Yeah, as you know, in the South, gender norms have been much more egalitarian than in the North. And so our concern should be and so you'll see child marriage rates are very low in the South. But on the other hand, there are some gender norms, even in the South, that persist. If you look at the violence data, you will see that that violence in the South is in some states higher than those in the North. So I think we can safely say that India on the whole is gender inegalitarian. But of course, on many issues in the South, marriages are more egalitarian. Sexual and reproductive health outcomes are much, much better. Education levels are higher, or at least the gender gaps are much narrower. And so in that sense, yes, there is a large difference in some indicators, but in others, we're not seeing that large difference, which suggests to me that gender transformative activities need to be conducted both in the South and in the North.
Right. Arunjit Singh has a question for you. Any reports that need to be studied to get a better grasp of adolescent health? Thank you, ma'am. And could you also comment on your understanding of peer educators in adolescent health programs?
On studies, there are a whole, actually Abba was telling me about the adolescents are a major, are a course in the public health department. So I'm sure they have some good stuff.
Yeah, I just mentioned that it's now part of the curriculum, I suppose, for some of the IIPH, MPH programs.
Okay. So maybe that's a good place to start. But do take a look at these adolescent surveys, the survey reports. There is the Youth in India survey, it's a 2010 document. Then there are the Udaya surveys from the Pop Council in 2017. And there is the Dasra survey in Jharkhand in 2018-19. And then there are a whole lot of smaller studies that you might take a look at. Globally, the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health produced a very interesting and comprehensive report in 2016 that you may want to look at as well. Okay, the second question was to comment on peer educators. Globally, peer educators have been pretty much dismissed because there's no evidence of their effectiveness. But I think in our case, where also we don't have much evidence on their effectiveness, the RKSK program has provision for peer education. And I think rather than poo-poo it, we need to make, to start working with it, to look at the peer educator curriculum, look at peer educator training, try and, at the moment, I don't think it's being done very systematically across the country. And so you have peer educators in name only, and that may not be effective either. But I think since we have the provision, let's try and use it, is the way I think of peer education just now, at least the opportunities we have in India. But I think your question is, do they work? And to my mind, at least you correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen any articles suggesting that they have been effective.
There is probably one last question and we can end, but that's really what you didn't want to address in your presentation,
Which is the
which
law.
is about the law.
Oh, I'm happy to.
There's also one
So,
more question in the chat box as well.
India has a legal framework to control child marriage. Why no action has taken against those who married below the legal age?
So first, let me just talk a bit about the law. The law as it stands holds child marriage as illegal if marriages take place below the age of 18. There are very stringent punishments for those who not only conduct the child marriage, but also witness it. So the tent wala and the caterer and all that can also be implicated. But as I said, this never happens, partly because families themselves don't want to risk having a family member go to jail. And partly because those who implement the law are neither very sensitive, nor are they very committed to reducing child marriage. So I think that's the reason why. And I don't think the fact that child marriage has gone down so much has anything to do with the law. I think it's because people genuinely feel that child marriage may be wrong. Knowledge of the law is very perfunctory in most surveys. So I think there is a genuine demand among people to raise the age at marriage. Now, raising the age at marriage further to 21, which is what the government's latest initiative has been, and it will no doubt become a law soon. I think that is very unrealistic and very short-sighted again. Today, I think about 60% of girls aged 20 to 24 or 21 to 24 have married below the age of 20 or 21. 60%. And you're saying we're going to, with a law, change all that? I think that's very unrealistic. Secondly, yes, of course, you may have seen in that one paper that I showed, those who marry at ages 19, 20 are definitely better off than those who marry in childhood and worse off than those who marry after 21. But it's not that we're comparing apples and oranges. There are three different types of girls who marry at these different ages. Families differ. You saw that. Education differences, there's like a 40% spread. So it's those kinds of issues that that really determine whether girls can marry below or above 18 or 21. And I think ultimately it's a question of girls' choice and girls' rights. And if we're thinking about raising the age of marriage further, let's give girls those options. Let higher education become more accessible to girls. Let's let employment or employment opportunities become more available to girls. Give them options, give families options. Safety seems to be a major concern. Let us address safety. But simply by plonking a law is not going to work. And certainly doing what the government of Assam has done, to my mind, is criminal. To now get hold of those who may have married 10 years ago when the girl was 13 or 14 and prosecute them, to me makes no sense. If you're going to do it when the act is about to be performed. So, to my mind, the law has been very disappointing.
I mean, I suppose that also then, sheds light on why adolescent reproductive and sexual health policy is also not working as well as it should. Kumari Nayak had that question for you, but I'm not sure that this time. Could you throw light on why adolescent reproductive and sexual health policy is not effectively working? And would you like to respond?
At the moment, we don't have a policy per se. We have various laws, and we have this RKSK program, which is focusing on health, but it's looking so diversely at all domains of health, reaching into rights. I think there has not been a commitment to it. If you really look at this program, it's got a great deal of potential. But neither those at the top nor those who are, the peer educators and the trainers of the peer educators are particularly committed or invested in investing in young people. So I think that's why the program has not really taken off.
And on that sobering note, I think we will draw the session to a close, but thank you so much. It's been so illuminating and so instructive in terms of what might be needed, what should be done, and what the barriers and challenges can be. So thank you so much, Shireen. It's been such a pleasure.